This is hell.
It took a pandemic for workers in the U.S. to realize how much they hated their jobs, the low pay, the lack of benefits, and the instability of their employment. Workers finally got a chance to sit back, do their work from home, instead of having to haul themselves to some far-off workplace, and they came to the conclusion that their work is simply not worth all the time, energy, and often abuse they were experiencing just to make a buck. Some are calling this the Great Resignation as workers find better, more fulfilling livelihoods. But today's guest has a different name for it, returning to This Is Hell. David Dayen, who wrote the American Prospect article, The Great Escape, Why Workers Are Quitting Their Jobs After the Trauma of the Pandemic. Welcome back to This Is Hell, David.
Hey, thanks a lot for having me on again.
It's great to have you back on the show. You can follow David on Twitter at DDAYEN. You write that in September, 4.43 million workers followed a person you were talking about in your article, Carolyn Potts, lead and quit their job, a new record high that represents 3% of the American workforce leaving their jobs after 2.9% quit in August in lower wage sectors like leisure and hospitality and food services and accommodation. The numbers were as high as 6.6%, around 1 in every 15 workers. So the story in the mainstream establishment media is that employers cannot find workers. What is missed when the main story is not the record number of workers quitting their jobs to find better work?
Yeah, I mean, I think the missing story is the workers themselves. So one of the things I was very cognizant of going into the reporting on this is that the majority of pieces that we've heard about this labor shortage have come from either analysts that are looking at aggregate statistics or employers who are saying, hey, I can't find this guy or that guy to do this job or that job. Nobody was talking to the workers and saying, well, why are you quitting? Why are you seeking a better deal? Why are you looking for other employment or going back to school or starting your own business? Why are you doing this right now? And if you ask them, a very clear pattern emerges. The disproportionately, this so-called labor shortage is happening at the low end of the scale, the low wage end. And those jobs are terrible in the United States. And they've gotten worse, much worse during the pandemic. And the pandemic created this reckoning for low wage workers to say, I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm not going to risk my life, my mental capabilities, my mental health, in order to make a menial amount of money doing a menial task. I want more fulfillment. I want more dignity. I want more respect, and I'm going to go get it. And that has been, I think, one of the more enduring changes that we've seen come out of the pandemic. We thought at one point this is going to lead to legislative change, that we're going to recreate a real safety net at some point, or that there would be other just shifts within society, maybe the work from home revolution or other things. But I think this reckoning is actually the biggest change that we're seeing come out of the pandemic.
So what does it reveal to you? What does it say to you about more establishment mainstream media, CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, ABC, CBS, NBC, even PBS? What does it say to you about those kinds of media outlets when they are not asking workers why they are leaving their jobs? Because I think that's a perspective that is definitely lost when it comes to what is happening with this so-called labor shortage.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I want to totally cast aspersions on the rest of my media colleagues.
Oh, go ahead.
I just think that there's another story to be told here, and for whatever reason, it's not being told, and it's a very clear story that you see over the course of decades. I mean, low wage work in America really does not reflect low wage work in other countries. About 1/4 of U.S. workers are in what are considered low-wage jobs. That is the largest of any developed country in the world. If you go to a McDonald's in Denmark, they're paid $18 an hour, or the equivalent of that. If you go into other countries, there is not only better pay, but better conditions, more of a say for workers on the job, and so on and so forth. And that's just different in the United States. We low wage work is just not, it's not really livable in the US. And it was much worse after the pandemic, because now not only were you sort of demeaned and humiliated and pushed to do more and working under erratic schedules, but you were also now taking your own life and safety into your hands.
And you point out that over-financialization has added to the pain. More than 11.7 million U.S. workers, most of them low wage, now work for companies owned by private equity firms. With a business model of extracting as much cash out of portfolio businesses as possible, private equity has turned even more jobs into low-wage nightmares. So how are workers in what you call peer countries protected from this kind of exploitation by financialization and private equity firms, while that's not happening here in the United States?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just a larger percentage in the U.S. We are starting to see more private equity takeovers in the U.K., but by and large, this is a U.S. phenomenon. And a perfect example is the woman who I start the story with, which is Caroline Potts, who works for, or previously worked before she quit, worked for PetSmart, which is a private equity owned chain of pet stores. She was a dog groomer, and the conditions of her work got to a point such that she told me, when I would drive into work, I would hope that I would get into a car accident, because then I wouldn't have to go in. And this isn't like a foundry or a site from the 19th century, like a meat cutting plant or something like that. This is a pet groomer, right? This is not the stuff that you would expect to be nightmarish, but the pace of that job for her at PetSmart, the demand for turning over grooming of these pets as quick as possible, the indifference towards dogs and that were extremely stressed out or had behavioral problems. It was causing a situation where this woman, who was a real dog lover, a pet lover, was being forced during her job to inflict pain on animals, and she couldn't take it. And this is what a sort of bottom line squeeze labor, private equity owned model does to the average person. And in this moment of collective trauma, where we've all been dealing with a good deal of stress, I think that there has been a sense among the public, particularly among people who were in these low-wage kind of dead-end jobs, that work is one of the largest time blocks of the day. I spend as much time at work as I do really doing anything else, and that time block cannot be this horrific.
But you also point out that when it comes to PetSmart, company policy was supposed to prohibit grooming dogs with seizure disorders or those that couldn't handle the stressful environment. Many of the work conditions that Caroline was experiencing were supposedly not allowed by company policy. But you point out where she was working in Murfreesboro, Caroline was continually pushed to groom them anyway. And then she tells you some pets can die in the kennel from stress. One dog was terrified of the dryer and they wanted me to dry her straight through. They said, figure it out. So to you, what explains, how does private equity affect that company policy and then it changing by the time it gets down to individual stores?
Well, private equity is a business model that buys up these companies based on a lot of debt and then loads the debt onto that company, so that the company, in addition to having to pay its workers and pay for goods and supplies and all of the sort of overhead of a normal business, they also have to service this massive amount of debt every month. They have to pay back all these creditors. And so something has to give. And usually what does give in order for them to be going forward business is they cut labor costs to the bone. They cut costs on workplace safety and stuff like that. And in this case, they were trying to maximize revenue, right, by taking all comers, any kind of dog that needed to be groomed, and the fears and of the workers and the nightmare sort of the workplace was made secondary. And so this was a revenue maximization strategy. It was a bottom line at all costs strategy, and that is very typical of what we see out of these companies that are owned by investment firms.
And we saw this happen here in Chicago with the Dominicks grocery store chain. And as soon as they got bought up by private equity, pretty much everybody knew that Dominicks was going to go out of business. You give the example of Ed Godomsky, who worked at Waterbury Hospital in Connecticut in the IT department for 32 years before the private equity firm Leonard Green and Partners, an LA-based private equity firm, took over. Godomsky tells you in the first year, layoffs became a household word. Longevity employees were particularly targeted. But don't these layoffs undermine the ability for the business to be effective at what they do when it comes to providing quality service for customers? Why would an investor want to invest in a company that was just bought by a private equity firm? Why is an investor, what if I was an investor, would I not be able to see the writing on the wall and get out before the company, as they often do, collapse?
Well, sure, but that's not the point when you're talking about private equity. So you're not the whole point of private is they're not publicly traded companies, right? So what a private equity firm wants to do is extract as much value out of that company for themselves as possible. It doesn't really matter to them whether the company becomes a going concern after they've sucked as much life out of it as possible. They are completely concerned with taking management fees, taking any kind of fees that they can. And what happens to the company doesn't matter at that point because they've already made their money back and then some. So that's kind of the model. And it's a model that really is specifically interested in rewarding these investors at the expense of workers. So it's not very surprising that when I started talking to people about why they quit their jobs, people who worked at private equity firms came back over and over again because those jobs are some of the worst in our economy, and the pandemic certainly even worse than that.
So are essential workers any more or perceived as any more or less disposable since the pandemic began?
I mean, I think that's a really interesting question. I think that we created this myth of the essential worker, kind of. We created this idea that workers on the front lines who had to go to their jobs during the pandemic, risk themselves in some way, were heroic in some fashion. And workers started to take that to heart, right? They started to believe that yeah, we are essential, and that means that we can withhold our labor because we are needed to make this economy run. And that's what we're going to do. We're going to seek out better opportunities for ourselves because we're essential to the functioning of the U.S. economy. It's interesting to me, one of the things I put in the piece is that the last two really large-scale years in the 20th century for labor were 1919 and 1946. You saw more strikes in those years than any other in the 20th century. That was right after World War I and right after World War II, when workers came back, from overseas. They were in infantry and they were hailed as heroes for preserving democracy. And then they were put into jobs that were decidedly less than heroic. And they decided they didn't like that. And they were going to fight to make those jobs better for themselves. And while this wasn't a war, I think there are similarities between the experience of workers at this time and the experience of workers immediately after those two conflicts. Similarly, workers were sort of lauded for their bravery and their heroic nature, and they decided that they wanted more out of this large time block that they spend during their days. And I think that similarity is consistent. And then when I started looking at it, there was a consistency going back centuries after pandemics specifically that showed that worker power and sort of collective action was a feature of post-pandemic environments.
Especially following the Black Death, and we'll get to that in a moment. But not only, I was just thinking of this while you were answering the question, not only are we seeing this as a result of a pandemic, we did just end wars that certainly didn't have the same number of people as World War I or World War II had. So I'm wondering if that might be a contribution. But are there any signs that this can lead to a rejuvenated union movement as it did following both world wars, or are federal and state union laws now far too tilted against labor organizing compared to the early 1920s and later 1940s?
Well, that's the real key and the real million-dollar question here. You're not going to see, although we have seen more labor resistance, right? We've seen Striketober and a lot more strikes than we've seen in previous years. But the workforce is 7-8% unionized in the United States. So these trends particularly around low-wage work, you're not going to see unless you're looking at the non-union workforce. What we have seen are a lot of non-union walkouts. I talked to a group at a Jack in the Box in Sacramento who's walked out twice and won better conditions for themselves. You're seeing this, kind of all over the economy. There is a feature kind of collective action because of social media, whether it's the anti-work subreddit or the Quit My Job hashtag on TikTok. You're seeing people gain courage from watching other people quit. I talked to this woman who became sort of somewhat famous for quitting her job at a Walmart and posting the video of her quitting live over the PA system on TikTok, got millions of views. So there is this sort of element of collective consciousness and collective action to it. But ultimately, what I do say in the piece is that unless this translates into real labor organizing, then ultimately everything that we're seeing right now is going to be ephemeral. Now, what did we see last week? We saw workers at one Starbucks store vote to bring in a union. Looks like a second one there could have been voted at the same time in Buffalo. There's a little, it's not quite clear how that second vote is going to turn out. There are other Starbucks workplaces that are looking into this. There's a Dollar General in Connecticut that attempted to unionize. So I think the next evolution of this is seeing those workers who are kind of making this individual decision to quit their jobs. If it evolves into a situation where workers collectively at a workplace get together and say, you know what, we need to pull our voices and pool our voices together and try to create some sort of union membership, then I think you will see those changes endure to a greater degree.
But why didn't, for instance, your example in Sacramento with the Jack in the Box or the situation in Buffalo with Starbucks, why didn't Jack in the Box or Starbucks just cut workers' hours, bring in new employees, or just fire them all and start off with a new set of employees, as Kellogg's has with their workers, and that had a unionized workplace?
Well, they're attempting to do so at Kellogg. It's unclear whether that's going to be successful. In fact, there was a very amusing initiative that some folks on those similar channels that I talked about, those social media channels, to spam Kellogg with fake resumes so that they can't actually find workers because they have to sift through all these bogus applications. So we'll see what happens there. As far as the Jack in the Box, I mean, that is where this comes into play with a tight labor market. When you have a tight labor market, it's more difficult to find workers, and therefore workers gain a measure of power over their employers. And that was certainly the case in the Sacramento Jack in the Box, where the shift workers all walked out, and the managers had to sort of work the Jack in the Box, and it took all of 2 days of them working the Jack in the Box before they came back to the workers at that store and said, we'll fix the conditions, we'll pay you overtime, we'll raise your pay, we'll get this done. And they're actually part of a coalition in California that is trying to improve conditions using the legislative angle of mandating certain types of conditions at fast food restaurants within California. We saw also in New York, where the wage board said fast food workers need to make $15 an hour, for example. So there are legislative ways to deal with this. There are obviously collective bargaining ways to deal with this. But a tight labor market, those economic conditions obviously give workers an advantage to say, you know what, I'm going to quit. I'm going to find another job pretty easily. And I'm going to go where I can have the most fulfillment, the better conditions. The other thing we're seeing that should be mentioned is a lot of workers moving to start their own businesses. We have actually seen a real explosion of business formation since the pandemic, which is different than what happened during the last recession when business formation really cratered. What we're seeing now is millions of people make that attempt. Part of this is because after the pandemic, there was this increase. We sort of made a pop-up safety net so that people, through stimulus checks and enhanced unemployment and other features, were able to accumulate some savings. And that gave them the courage to go back out and take a risk economically by starting their own business. Now, a lot of businesses fail, and we're going to have to see over the next couple of years how that pans out. But it shows this better way that you could see for the economy, where you give people enough ability to take entrepreneurial risks.
You quote Michael Duff, a former Teamster who now teaches at St. Louis University School of Law, saying, "The pandemic activated this latent insecurity that was growing as a result of the gig economy in which no one is an employee. If work is so bad, I'll do anything to not do it. What do you have to lose? Your crappy, dangerous gig job." How does the precarious gig economy lead to enhanced worker power? Because the fear has been it would do and has done the exact opposite.
Well, it has. I don't think Michael is saying anything otherwise, but I think what he's saying is that there's a breaking point, and the pandemic helped create the conditions for that breaking point. It created this situation where the work that was on offer was just so bad that even if you weren't moving to start your own business or find another job or whatever, you were thinking, all right, well, if I give up this job, I'm giving up very, very low pay, a personal risk to myself, terrible conditions, being yelled at by superiors. What have I got to lose? And so I think that is part of the psychology of this, because it's very much, people who look at this and analyze it, they're looking at statistical analysis, they're looking at the conditions of the labor force and things of that nature. But I think you have to look at this psychologically as well. And I actually talked to a couple psychologists for this piece, that the circumstances of the pandemic and the trauma it created really did have this impact where it made people rethink the way that they were living their lives and try to come up with schemes where they could live it in the way that they best wanted to see. And sometimes that involved, going into the business for themselves. Sometimes it just involved not working and figuring out another way to survive that didn't involve this particular type of job. And some of it was sort of taking advantage of the opportunity of a tight labor market to find a better job for themselves. And this is, by the way, we're seeing this in the statistics. Even inflation aside, real wages at the low end of the scale are rising because, there's been this sort of collective revolt, almost a general strike of sorts among the low-wage workforce to say, we're not going to do this for the same amount of money in the same kind of conditions anymore. And I think that's really fascinating.
You mention where the Great Resignation meets the digital age. Walkout signs posted outside businesses routinely go viral, feeding a near insatiable anger with low-wage work. As you mentioned before, #QuitMyJob videos have been trending on social media sites for more than a year. On any given day, a nurse, an office drone, a Foot Locker clerk, or a preschool teacher can be seen taking the jump. Though the act of quitting is often individual, social media collectivizes it, creating community from an atomized and dislocated workforce in a splendid dialectic. The same digital technology that facilitates speed up and second-by-second monitoring by the boss facilitates acts of collective consciousness, organizing, and rebellion. But doesn't that control through digitization far outweigh any sense of collectivization when it comes to worker solidarity? How much can digitization undermine any attempts at solidarity?
Oh, plenty. I mean, that's certainly true, and that's certainly been the trend over the past several years. I mean, there are now ways in which your employer can see whether or not you're doing keystrokes or clicks on your at-home computer to see if you're being productive. The fact that you have certain workforces that work from home creates a situation where there isn't a water cooler, there isn't a way to really get with your fellow workers and talk about opportunities to make change. However, those same tools can bring people together from across many different workforces and engage in this dialogue with one another in ways that we're seeing right now. And I think that's something that maybe was unanticipated by employers, but it's certainly become fairly powerful. And the other thing about it is that while certainly this digitization can atomize a workforce, the workforces that I'm looking at in this piece, the low wage end of the scale, a lot of these are customer facing, retail, restaurant, in-person workforces who are not necessarily in that same position of being now a lot of them are monitored and surveilled. If you're talking about Amazon or things like that, where your every move of your body is tracked and your rate of movement to fulfill orders or something like that is surveyed and written down, and you can be thrown out of your job because you did 6 packing in an hour instead of 7 or whatever. That's very, very true. However, I think that what we're seeing right now with respect to social media has sort of, as I've said, collectivized a very individual decision.
And as you were saying earlier, you mentioned the time of the Black Death, which in its most highly affected areas wiped out half the population between 1347 and 1351. The extreme labor shortage gave serfs and peasants who worked the land for the wealthy power they had never seen before in their lives. The ability to bargain for cash wages, lower rent, less hazardous conditions. They could find opportunities at artisanal craft guilds in the cities or just at the neighboring lord's village. They could use the market for labor to pick and choose their circumstances for the first time. And you quote an expert who says that the thing you see so often today is, why won't these people work for $14, $15 an hour? You see the same thing from chroniclers of these abbeys, the major employers of the day. They aren't working for what they worked for 2 years ago. It's a moralized statement that they're lazy, uppity, have forgotten their place in the natural order. Now, this sounds exactly, and I'm sorry for bringing up the media again, this sounds exactly like the coverage on Fox News that I saw this week. Does Fox News interests reflect the interests of lords in feudal times? And if so, why do so many people who define themselves as working class support a network that represents the best interests of exploitative employers? How is that attractive to the working class and their audience?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly agree with that. I mean, one answer to that is that they heighten cultural issues that sort of discount some of this labor stuff. But I really think that the similarities between what we saw after the Black Death and what we're seeing now are really, really interesting. I was happy that I was able to talk to some folks who were able to contextualize that for me better. One of the things we saw is the backlash from the employers of that time, which has many similarities to the employers of this time, like, many of the people I assume you see on Fox News. The first real major labor law in England came right out of the Black Death. It was called the Ordinance of Laborers. And it did a lot of things to sort of restore this hypothetical moral order, the social order of things. It blocked workers from moving around in order to get a better deal for themselves. It put in wage controls. It also put in price controls, which is kind of interesting. Everyone under the age of 60 was required to work. If you weren't pledged to someone to work, and you could be plucked out by a lord of some sort and said, I can compel your service for a year at this particular prevailing wage. And it even blocked beggars from using funerals to gain alms, which was a major way in which poor people sustained themselves at the time. And so you had this labor structure, this legislative structure that said you are not allowed to use this time when there was a literal labor shortage. There literally weren't enough people to work the fields. You're not allowed to use that to your own benefit. And what's so interesting about that is that it didn't work, that employers still paid more, even though they were prohibited from doing so, in order to secure the best workers. They still, even though higher wages were forbidden, they were still setting them at that level. There were thousands of cases with local justices of the peace that showed that serfs and peasants just didn't want to follow these particular rules. And you're seeing almost the same thing now, that employers are griping and trying to get their state legislatures to pass new laws. They cut off unemployment benefits, enhanced unemployment benefits, the pandemic era stuff. They cut those off early in 25 states, and that was explicitly to bring people back to the workforce. By the way, employment in states that didn't cut off those unemployment benefits early rose at the same exact rate as in these other states, so it had no effect whatsoever. But it's not working. People are still quitting their jobs. They're not being forced back, sort of at the barrel of a gun, to these low wage situations, and it shows the role of the psyche in this. That you can set up all the laws you want, but it's hard to force somebody to do something they don't want to do.
You point out how today bidding wars for people transitioning to two new jobs are routine. When minimum wages at a number of retail establishments are rising and the average wage at restaurants and grocery stores just hit $15 an hour, Starbucks has raised average pay to $17 an hour, flight attendants working holiday shifts at American Airlines are earning as much as triple pay, wage growth overall in the key low-wage leisure and hospitality sectors at 12.4% year over year, well above even the elevated rate of inflation. To you, what explains then why the federal minimum wage hasn't been made into law yet when so many minimum wage jobs in the private sector are now paying far more than minimum wage?
Yeah, I mean, this is something where the private sector and the changes that they've made to their wage structures have driven these benefits for low-wage workers far more than any kind of edict has. Now, there are many states where the minimum wage, cities and states where it's become $15 an hour or more, starting up in Seattle and then California and New York and cities across the country. And every time the minimum wage is put and minimum wage increase is put on the ballot, voters approve it in record numbers. I mean, so we've seen the minimums rise over and over again within the states. Now, there are a few holdouts that are still stuck at the federal level of $7.25 an hour. And obviously, employers hold a lot of sway over those legislatures and we're at the federal level, and we just haven't seen that move forward. But when Amazon says we're going to pay $15 an hour at warehouses, that gives sort of an escape valve to anybody who's making less than that to say, okay, I could always go over there and make more. And that forces other employers to raise their minimums, like Target and Costco and Walmart and what have you. And you create this virtuous circle. And the act of quitting plays into that, right? If it creates this situation where there's something approaching a labor shortage, then employers simply have to offer more to attract workers to get in and take care of that. So that is creating this increase by itself, even without a federal mandate. Now that might sound like sort of a conservative idea, right? That the free market will take care of it. What we know is that when these circumstances change, that if there is no floor set, then there's nothing stopping employers from driving those wages way back down. And so that's why you need some sort of floor to create a living wage condition so that nobody who works 40 hours a week for a living is still living in poverty.
You're right. People do still have money in the bank from the various COVID relief programs, including 3 stimulus checks and expanded unemployment insurance, combined with the forced savings of a lot of places not being open for months. It totals extra savings of roughly $2.4 trillion, giving people time to make career decisions. But as the New York Times keeps telling us, all of that buying power is now being undermined by inflation, which has led the Biden administration to announce there will not be any more federal aid. How much does inflation threaten savings that have allowed workers to survive? Because I think in that inflation story, we're missing a big part of the fact that real wages are rising.
Yeah, real wages are rising at the low end of the scale, and they're rising at the high end of the scale. And in the middle class, real wages are actually falling. And if you look at it sort of on an aggregate basis, real wages are down a little bit in the last few months. And that is creating a lot of the discontent that you're seeing out there. The inflation story is complex. It has a lot to do with these supply chain issues, which is in some ways kind of another worker story. In other ways, it's a corporate power story. We've been doing a lot of reporting on that. And actually, our next print issue, this was the cover of our previous print issue. Our next print issue is going to be entirely about that supply chain and its relationship to inflation. But it is a threat to workers who may be making more, but then are having to pay more for necessities, which are a large portion of their overall spending. So it is something that certainly alarms policymakers, politicians, and what they always talk about is this sort of wage price spiral where wages go up and then prices go up to compensate for the wages going up, and then you know, where does it end, right? That's not what we're seeing in the economy. The price increases are very much largely due to supply chain issues, and we know this because the price increases are happening well above any kind of input cost level. What we see over and over from companies is they're announcing their record earnings that are, you know, for the largest companies, as much as 50% above their earnings levels in 2019. And I'm talking about net margins. So in other words, they're not passing costs on to customers. They are passing well above those costs on to customers, which means they are not in any way in a situation where the wages that they're having to pay because of the Great Resignation or because of whatever are outstripping their ability to make a profit. They're making much larger profits than they were before. A lot of the inflation story is a story around corporate profiteering, using the inflation as an excuse to then increase prices even more. And we're seeing this across the economy, and that's a function of concentrated corporate power where people do not have a choice other than to go for these necessities to, you know, a handful of companies that are all raising their prices around the same rate.
Concentrated corporate power is definitely not what's being discussed within that discussion of inflation. But how much is this inflation then, in your opinion, verging on price gouging?
It is verging on that. And, you know, we see that in a lot of key areas. One, it being, for example, in grocery prices, much of the increases is really in proteins and meats and dairy and things like that. And what we know from looking at various other statistics is that the prices that meat processing companies, and meat processing companies are extremely concentrated. About 4 companies control anywhere between 60 and 80% of all meat processing, depending on the meat. We see that these companies are paying very low prices for cattle and hogs and chickens, but they're charging very high prices at the grocery store. So they are sitting in the middle of this and using their information advantage to gain record excess profits. And so that's a perfect example of what we're talking about here. And the Biden administration has talked about that. What they're going to do about it kind of remains to be seen. There are certain price fixing allegations, and there have been convictions in the meat processing field. Whether they will take it beyond meat and go into other areas remains to be seen. But I think there's a lot of reason that they should, and at the very least, talk about this in a way that gets people to understand what the real forces around inflation are.
And you point out that we're also seeing a thinner labor force from an aging society and severe Trump-era restrictions on immigration. Over 2 million more workers retired during the pandemic than would have been expected. All of this tips the balance in favor of those remaining in the labor market. So, David, is there a labor shortage out of choice by workers, or is there a labor shortage because of an aging population and fewer migrant workers? Because the way the labor shortage is depicted, it's all a matter of choice by privileged workers.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a mix, right? We've known about these demographic issues for a long time. I mean, we knew that we had an aging workforce. And the fact that we had this huge crackdown on immigration over the past few years only worsened that. It did not allow us to replenish that workforce with foreign workers. So we knew that there was a reckoning here in terms of a shrunken workforce, but all of that is kind of at the margins. None of that is at the level of millions of workers quitting their jobs every month. That is, I think, the bigger driver here. And a lot of those workers are quitting for better opportunities, right? And a lot of them are quitting to start their own businesses. And a lot of them are quitting to do other things, whether it's college or caregiving or whatever. And so this is a multifaceted issue. As you know, it's in a workforce that's 154 million people. I don't think there's any one story that can explain the intricacies of that. But what I would say is that when you do look at this closely, you do see that workers, particularly at the low wage end of the scale, are coming to an understanding with themselves that they don't want to participate in an economy that humiliates them and exploits them. And the only way for that to be fixed is for employers to give them a better bargain.
You were mentioning this before about how people are starting their own businesses. You write, this has been a pronounced trend paralleling the Great Resignation. Business formation through 3/4 of 2021 is on trend to set an all-time high, with over 1.4 million applications to start new businesses filled through September. This is a complete transformation of the anemic business formation out of the Great Recession in 2008. But a disproportionate number of new businesses applications are in the retail, food, accommodation, and hospitality sectors, hit so hard by the pandemic and so freighted with low-wage workers. So is this entrepreneurialism grounded in the same low-wage exploitation as the entrepreneurs are trying to escape themselves?
Well, I think it's in some ways started by those low-wage workers. And I think that the challenge that they're going to face is as their business expands, how are they going to find help in a way that honors the fact that their circumstances came from breaking free of a low-wage work cycle that demeaned them. When we were talking about these jobs in terms of retail or food or things like that, this is talking about people selling things on the internet, for example, or going to farmers markets and doing sales there. At the outset, that doesn't necessarily require a large workforce. But as those businesses expand, should they be fortunate enough to expand, you are going to need help. And that moment is whether we see whether the sort of honorable way in which workers are sort of opting out of this deal that has been made for them around low-wage work, whether they go back to that and use the very same tactics, or whether they turn it around and say, you know what, I'm not going to put other people in the position I was put in.
Just two more questions for you, David. You write, sure. What's notable is that rank-and-file union members are the ones unilaterally shutting down workplaces and even rejecting contracts negotiated by their own leadership. There's a level of distrust and disappointment in the status quo among workers that extends even to their elected representatives and unions. And so I was hoping that this might lead to greater labor organizing, more unions. But can this lead to unions that are not as accommodating to bosses as they have historically been over the last 30 to 40 years? Are workers radicalizing, if you will, the labor movement that the unions and the unions that represent them?
It's a big question. We've been doing a lot of reporting on that. Our Harold Meyerson, who's a labor expert, has written a lot about this. There are a lot of examples here to draw from. John Deere, the workers there rejected 3 contracts that their leadership agreed to before finding one that paid more. Same at Kellogg's, where they rejected the last offer from management, which the leadership of the union said this is something we might want to take. The Teamsters just threw out the establishment leadership and put in a reform slate. There are a lot of examples here of union rank and file sort of having this kind of discontent, reflecting the sort of radicalization of workers at the non-union level. I think there's a similar dynamic going on there. And where that goes is going to be really, really interesting as we move forward.
We have been speaking with David Dayen, who wrote the American Prospect article, The Great Escape, Why Workers Are Quitting Their Jobs After the Trauma of the Pandemic. You can follow David on Twitter at DDAYEN. David was on our show back in 2018, and you can find that interview by searching on his last name at our website, thisishell.com. And as we do with all of our guests, David, you may or may not remember, we end with the question from hell, the question we hate to ask, you may hate to answer, or our audience is going to hate your response. You write, people are valuing fitting work around their life, not the other way around. What happens to neoliberalism when worker thinking shifts from my life must fit around work to my work must fit around my life? Or will it have any impact at all?
It's a dangerous question for neoliberal thinking, right? Because their thinking is entirely based on markets and having sort of this reserve army of the unemployed that is able to fit in whenever they need a task done. Is this going to change anything? I mean, that's kind of the huge question, right? I mean, we could have a recession start shortly, and workers are put in that same disadvantageous position, and all of the gains that came from this are lost as the new businesses falter and workers need to find something to do in order to sustain themselves. So this isn't a 100% story one way or the other, but I do think that there's a mindset that has changed. There is a belief system that has changed, and that's more difficult than just there are certain economic circumstances that create conditions that put people in positions where they have to do things that are distasteful to them, right? But when the mindset is simply different, when people don't want to put up with it anymore, that's a harder thing for employers to have to deal with. And I think they are going to have to deal with it in the coming years.
David, I really appreciate you being back on the show. We are going to annoy you in the future to have you on more quicker than just 3 years and 3 months later. So I really appreciate you being on the show. This is a fascinating article, and people should check out your work at the American Prospect. Thank you so much for being on the show, and happy holidays.
All right. Thank you, and happy holidays to you.
Thank you.
You've been listening to a This Is Hell interview. For more interview hell and to support the show, visit thisishell.com.